Okay, I think we will get started. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm Mark Placito. I'm Senior Director of Identity at Elsevier, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. So today we're going to learn about how the University of Melbourne Library transitioned from IP proxy access to using federated authentication only to access Elsevier resources using Open Athens. And I'm delighted to be joined by two guests, Caroline Gould, Manager of Discovery at the University of Melbourne, and Christos Skoutas, Senior Business Development Manager at Open Athens. So Caroline will be giving us some background on the library and then talk about some of the motivations behind the project. Christos is on hand to answer any specific questions about Open Athens. So before I hand over to Caroline, I just wanted to remind you of a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, this webinar is being recorded and everyone will be sent a link with the recording after the event has closed. And second, please use the Q&A feature to ask questions. You can send them at any time. And maybe if you could also indicate if your question is for Caroline or for Christos, that would be great. So I think that's it. So I'll hand things over to you, Caroline.
Thanks, Mark. All right, I've got some slides which I hope will load momentarily. While they're loading. So my name's Caroline Gould, as Mark said. I'm the manager of the Discovery team at the University of Melbourne Library. I'm speaking today from home because we're still closed down because of COVID at the moment and we're working off campus. My home is on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So I always like to start my talks by acknowledging their traditional custodianship and their ongoing custodianship of the land and paying my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I manage the team in the University Library who look after discovery and access. So I've got a bit of information about the university for those of you who are not familiar with the Australian university sector. Melbourne is one of the older universities in Australia. We've been established since 1853 and we rank very highly on the usual university rankings for research and study and teaching. We're generally #1 in Australia and somewhere in the 30s or 40s on any ranking in the world for teaching and research. We're quite a broad institute. We have research institutes associated with us across every area of every discipline that you might expect to find in a university. I've given you a few facts and figures here about the size of the university because it will help explain why we were interested in federated authentication a little further down the track. We have always at least 50,000 plus equivalent full-time students. And generally that with the 8,000 odd staff, it adds up to around 70 to 75,000 active accounts at any one time, so people who might be interested in using the library resources. Our teaching is slightly different to some other universities in that 50% of our students are undergraduate and about 50% graduate, so roughly half and half. The statistics on the screen there are from 2019. They'll be a little different now, obviously. But that mix of graduate and undergraduate students is across all disciplines. We have a big medical school, a leading law school, we teach in engineering, we've got a leading fine arts area, music, all the way across every field. So that means that our library collection reflects what our students and staff are interested in. So the library collection is spread across 11 branch libraries. We have a number of campuses, and so each campus has one or more libraries, and they're roughly focused on different discipline areas. Across the libraries, we have about 5,000 seats for students, so we can seat about 10% of the students at any one time in the libraries. We have about 150 staff across the libraries. Our collection is also managed off-store in 2 major stores. We have, I think it's around 2.5 million print items and well over 2 million ebooks. They're a little harder to count because of the patron-driven acquisition processes, but certainly it's a substantial collection in anyone's eyes. What we have most heavily used in the library are our 200,000 plus online journals. The e-journal collection is substantial here, and it is the most popular part of our library service. The e-journal use vastly outnumbers all of the other use in the library. We do publish ourselves, and we have a research publications section where we store about 40,000 of the university's research outputs, but that's just a small number of the ones that are out there. So e-journal usage is pretty high. Around 10 million e-journals are used every year, and there've been maybe multiple articles from each of those journals. And then more than 4 million uses of our ebooks a year. Circulation of print items is no longer a thing that the library really does in any way. We do circulate some, but they tend to be more items that are browsed in the library. So when we're looking at providing access to our information resources, our online access methods are really important to us, because that's how our students and staff like to connect to our information. I like to assess the effectiveness of our systems by looking at the user's experience of access. And so when we did this recently, we discovered that our clients were having some problems. I've got here some of the comments I got verbatim from our students when we asked them what their experience was like with Discovery. When we went into a little detail with some of these, and I'm sure you can feel, as I did, for the poor person whose comment is in red there, who was clearly beating their head on their desk, terribly distressed. When we got to the bottom of all of these, we realised that the problem was that the proxy that we were using didn't log people in to the platform that they were on. And people's experience of the internet these days is that they will be personally recognised. They log into a lot of sites like Amazon, Facebook, Google, you know, all of their apps on their phone, and they expect to have a more personalised experience and to be recognised as themselves. They also expect to be able to leave something and then come back to it later on and find it there. So when the proxy doesn't recognise them as an individual, and when it doesn't keep them logged in for a long period of time, they get frustrated by the experience and they can't understand what's going on. So our experience from talking to our clients and seeing how they worked was that they weren't coming directly to the library systems in order to look for things. They were coming from Google. When you looked at where they started their research, well over 75% of them started on Google, and almost as many started on Google Scholar. I think that they believe that Google is the place to search, and they just automatically go there to start searching, even if that might be just refining their what they might be looking for, you know, getting some keywords, refining the topic of their assignment or their research question. But certainly starting at Google is the common experience, whether they're researchers, staff or students. And so that told me that I had a lot of people who were ending up at an information resource without first coming to the library system, and therefore they didn't have a link that would automatically log them in. So I was looking for ways that I could support them to continue that workflow that they were obviously used to, and not have as many barriers, not have as many issues with logins, not have as many problems coming back to where they were. And that's what led me to Open Athens. Open Athens being federated authentication, it can be made available as the institutional login on all of our large vendor sites. And when our staff and students use that process to log in, they'll be recognised as themselves, they'll be able to use all the features of the vendor's platform, and they'll be able to come back to where they were previously. So it also, because it's a specifically library focused product, all of the sites that they support logging in to are the major information vendors. We have now over 600 of our vendors set up in Open Athens. In fact, it's almost all of our vendors set up in Open Athens, and over 80% of our traffic goes through a federated access point. Instead of being proxied, they are going in as individuals. So that means that they're recognised as themselves, and they're able to save their particular searches easily. So when they do sign in, there are some other benefits I'll just run through now. So when they do sign in to one of our vendors' platforms, they're doing so mediated via Open Athens, but they are still actually using the same university login that they use to get into any other system. If they're a student, they might go into our learning management system. If they're a staff member, they'll go into the intranet or into our email, and they will use exactly the same credentials to get into a library system, any library subscription, as they would to any other university resource or system. And so that shows them that the resources that they're logging into are approved by the university and are, they're authoritative. And it means that they don't have to have a whole lot of different accounts with different passwords. They don't need to understand what's happening. They just know they're logging in via the university. Some of the other benefits for the federated access for us have been about making the access control appropriate. So Open Athens has a setup that enables you to put in permission sets. So it would be possible for us to set up some resources that could only be used by the law students, for instance, or by the staff from the education faculty. And that means that we're able to provide a finer grain access control. And we're not doing a lot of things that we used to do when we ran a proxy, like monitoring for license breaches, ensuring things were used appropriately and looking at their, the where people had logged in from and what they were doing on particular platforms. That access control can sit with the central IT department, and in the library, we just have to worry about what resources can be made available to our staff and students, and which staff and students are authorised to access those resources. So we've got an appropriate level of control, and we're not having to learn about things like security for technology that we are not really our specialty area. So that improves security all around, because it means that the university's central IT system, which incorporates multi-factor authentication and will expire when they are no longer with the university, is what's controlling their access to the library resources. Takes a great load off our workload by allowing the IT department to manage that for us. It also allows us to control personal data release. Prior to moving to Open Athens, we did have some single sign-on arrangements set up with some individual vendors. And we had to do that because you can't use mapping solutions, for instance, with a proxy. And some of the legal vendors insist upon knowing the names of everybody who's logging into their platforms. So we had to set up individual SSO arrangements. But because they weren't controlled by the library, there were arrangements between the vendor and our central IT department, we weren't able to control what personal data was being released, and we weren't able to mediate on behalf of library clients when there was a problem. So having a federated solution like Open Athens means we can do that. So the federated access has been really beneficial for all of these reasons, and also because when you have federated access, you have exactly the same login process, whether you're on campus or off campus. And I suppose many libraries would have had trouble when the pandemic started, and they previously had systems that were set up to show that you were working on campus. Suddenly everybody was at home and they're not on campus anymore. And so those workarounds are really being put under a lot of strain in the current working environment. But if you move to a federated access solution like Open Athens, exactly the same process happens whether the student is on campus or off campus. They see the university login in their browser, they fill it in once, and they go into that resource and any other library resource without logging in again, which is a great benefit to them. Reduces the time that they spend logging into things, and it means the experience is the same no matter where they are, which we think is a really important feature for us. So that's my little summary of why we've moved to federated access and Open Athens in particular. And what I want to do now is to, I think we're going to have some questions and answers that Mark will manage. I should mention that Christos is here from Open Athens if there are any technical questions, because he's a better person to answer those than I am. So I'll hand back over to you, Mark, and we can go on to the Q&A.
Great, thanks very much, Caroline. That was really interesting. Before I get to there have been a couple of questions come in. I just, if you don't mind, wanted to ask you a question first. I'm just interested to know what has been the reaction from your user community to this move. Has it gone down well? Have there been any surprises?
Yeah, it's gone down really well, actually, and I would count that because prior to the move, we used to get a lot of fault reports through our incident management system where people were having issues with the proxy, or couldn't log into particular resources. And we've lost all that work. Pretty much all of it is gone. We have a small number of incidents now, but probably a tenth or less what we had before. The big surprises for us were that when you sign up for a federated access solution like Open Athens, they have to list you publicly before you're properly set up. And about an hour after the Open Athens team published the University of Melbourne in their list, I started getting phone calls from people who were trying to log in as University of Melbourne students or staff to particular resources and couldn't get through. So people find these ways of logging in pretty much on their own. And that's been a real surprise to us, the fact that people are out there doing workflows that don't involve the library systems at all, and a federated solution will just help them to get through a lot of barriers.
Right. So did you do much advertising or communication to your user community with this change?
No, I haven't mentioned Open Athens in any communication to the user community at all. And I think the reason I didn't do that was because I tried to explain it to my boss and I had half a dozen goes. Look, I'm not a technical, I'm an IT person, but I'm not good enough to explain this technical, complex idea to somebody who has no background in IT. I simply couldn't explain it to her. And that made me think, what am I trying to tell my staff and students about here? And I'm not actually really trying to tell them anything. I simply wanted to make sure that they felt comfortable and secure, that they could log into something and they knew that it was part of the university system. And seeing our standard university logo and login page means that they do think that they're logging into a university site. So I felt, well, I don't really need to tell them about Open Athens, because all Open Athens does is direct them to the university's authentication, and then they get into the library subscription. So I didn't need to really say anything at all. What we have done is we've updated all of our communications out to people to let them know that they should use their central university account to log into library resources. That's it. We don't mention Open Athens. Well, I talk about it a lot in venues like this because it's been really great. But our end users really don't need to know about it. And I'm sure other library staff like me would find it difficult to explain to their end users very succinctly, what it is and why they need it.
I see. So you just basically want it to work and be in the background.
Absolutely. It needs to work and not throw hissy fits and not break down at crucial moments. So, and that's what it does, really. People can go to a vendor website and search and find the way to log in, or they can use one of the browser tools that we support, which will log them in automatically, or they can, they can do a whole range of different workflows, and the federated authentication will support that. And because it's a true single sign-on, they really only sign on once to any university system in their browser session, and away they go. No further sign-on prompt.
Great, thank you. So we had a few questions coming in. Let me see. Just a couple of practical ones. Will the participants be provided any certificate of participation after the webinar is over? That's a good question. I don't know. I know you'll get the link to the recording, so let me see if I can find out about that. There's another one from India. A colleague wants to know if he or she can connect with you afterwards. Maybe that's something we can take offline. Maybe the person who sent that question can send your details through, and then we can put you in touch with
Google
Caroline.
me. If you type my name, my surname is spelled Gauld, G-A-U-L-D. So if you type my name and University of Melbourne into Google, you should be able to find my email address on the University of Melbourne website. And you're more than welcome to email me.
Great, thanks, Caroline. That's fine. So you mentioned your users, a lot of your users starting at Google. I think you said it was over 75%. That's right. Quite a high number. I have a question here. It says, if a student starts a search on Google, are they automatically directed to this product through Open Athens? I think the question was.
So we don't direct them to Open Athens, but if they start a search on Google and they end up on, say, an Elsevier website, they'll see the institutional login buttons, or they see a login button, and they should be able to find the institutional login process. When they do that and they search for the University of Melbourne as their institution, Open Athens mediates their login. The actual authentication happens via our central IT, and Open Athens is making sure that they get in to the right resources. So we might have some resources on a platform that are only made available for staff in a certain faculty. Open Athens will just make sure that happens in the background. They don't really see Open Athens very much. It is usually listed as a login option, and if it is, and our users know about it, they can search. But if not, all the major vendors, like Elsevier, for instance, will have a process for finding your institution that will just automatically show up the Open Athens login for you.
Right.
The other way that people can log in is you use one of those browser extensions, which will just automatically send them to Open Athens.
Yes, you mentioned those. Can you tell us what some of those are?
Yeah, so we've got Lean Library, we've got LibKey Nomad, and also EndNote Click, which used to be called Copernio. So they're from 3 different companies and they operate in different ways. And so we try to support as many as possible because, you know, a researcher in the fine arts will have a very different research process to somebody in medical and biological sciences. So we want to try to support as many different research processes as possible. So we try to support as many tools as we can. Lean Library will log people into vendor websites. LibKey Nomad will present PDF download links, and EndNote Click will do that and integrate with your EndNote reference management tool. So there's some of the tools that we also support.
Great, thank you. It's another question. Has the federated access option by way of Open Athens led to any appreciable increase in students accessing the e-resources? Also, do you hold any sort of scalable digital literacy sessions in times as now featuring this federated access option? So that's a 2-part question.
2-part question. Now, first of all, I'll have to tell you that we focus very strongly on the overseas education market. We lost a huge number of our students last year but due to the pandemic, and just as many this year. So we think that we probably have much lower enrolment now than we were expecting. Perhaps we were expecting to have around 70,000 students and we probably have around 52. So that makes it difficult to determine because we went live with Open Athens at the beginning of last year, just a couple of months before the pandemic. So I can't really tell you whether there was an increase in the use of the resources because we had such a decrease in our student population. I think probably we would see a small increase, but I think what we would see is rather than an increase in the use of the resources, because they're so much easier to get into, we'd see more people coming in rather than, you know, higher use overall. And the second part of that question, for digital literacy sessions, we don't promote Open Athens, we promote how to get into the library subscriptions. And so we say we prefer you to come to the library search tools. If you don't do that and you go to Google, look for the institutional login. If you can't find institutional login, look for Open Athens. But people will find that even if you don't talk about it, as we discovered on the first day. So it isn't really necessary to promote federated access as a separate thing.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So, Caroline, I know for Elsevier resources, you have essentially switched off IP altogether.
Yeah, totally.
Have you done that for other vendors, or are you still maintaining IP and proxy access for other vendors?
So we do. Open Athens allows you to use IP authentication if you need to. Christos might be a better person to explain that than me, but we had a couple of single sign-on arrangements before we moved to Open Athens, 6 I think. We moved those across to Open Athens and it allowed us to use federated access for over 120 of our vendors in total. So we went from having just 6 individual arrangements to having over 120 all in one go. So they're all off proxy and all off IP. The other 480 odd vendors that we have use some form of IP access, but Open Athens has allocated us a different IP and they manage that on our behalf. So yeah, so we still do have that IP authenticated access, but because it's an Open Athens IP, yeah, it's not really something we have to manage internally on internal equipment.
Yeah, so Christos, maybe I could ask you then, can you explain a bit more about how that works, using a proxy solution via Open Athens versus the federated access?
it's mainly how it works, you know, with the proxy. So we allocate the, as Caroline said, the IP address, and we manage everything on our side. So, for example, institutions don't have to manage that kind of process. We have dedicated personnel to manage that configuration file, to liaise with other publishers. Of course, our preferred method is authentication via federated access, you know, for all the reasons that Caroline mentioned before. But we understand that, you know, the publishing industry, you know, moves at different paces. Some publishers are still using IP authentication. So what we try to do is that be practical about it and say, okay, well, at the moment we can set you up with IP, but also, you know, we can move you to federated access. And we talk to lots of publishers to try to move them to federated access and become a member of, you know, Open Athens Federation. So it's, you know, promoting federated access, which is the most secure authentication method, but also be practical about it and try to manage everything on our end so that, you know, libraries don't have to worry about these things, don't have to worry, okay, I have federated access by Open Athens, but I have to manage my proxy service, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. We found that when we had a proxy server, we were the target of a lot of hacking attempts because we have such a big collection and it crosses pretty much every discipline. So if you wanted to get into something that, you know, you weren't really legally allowed to access, trying to get into the University of Melbourne system was a good way to get access to pretty much everything that you needed. So we found that moving to federated authentication reduced the security problems for the whole university because people aren't trying to hack into our proxy server. Open Athens have got that covered for us. It's really nice.
Right, great. Caroline, you touched on control over the release of personal data.
Yeah.
And I wanted to explore that a bit more with you. So I know there are some concerns in the academic community about, you know, the use of personal attributes that are released via federated access.
Yeah.
What do you actually need to release via Open Athens to allow that user experience? It's
pretty, for most logins, it's pretty minimal, and it varies from vendor to vendor. So I'll just give the details for what we've set up. This will vary depending upon your contract with each vendor, obviously. So I had some single sign-on arrangements in place before, and some of those required us to release the user's name and email address. And so we've maintained those because they're in our license agreement. But for Elsevier products, for instance, we didn't have that. And we have a contract which allows us to provide walk-in public access to some of the Elsevier resources we subscribe to. So when Open Athens connects to our local authentication system and somebody sets up an account, or goes into Open Athens, our local authentication system transfers some attributes into Open Athens, somebody's name, their email address, their department, whether they're a staff or student, that kind of thing. We've got the minimal amount in there. And then we decide, vendor by vendor, which of those, if any, we will release to let that person get into another vendor's system. In the case of Elsevier, we don't release anything except a pseudonymous token. We have a Shibboleth connection that just releases this pseudonymous token. It's kind of long string of gobbledygook that is the same for you every time you go in there, but doesn't contain your name or your email address. If somebody wants to use some of the features of the Elsevier platforms that require them to identify themselves, Elsevier pops up a little page and says, you know, who are you, what's going on? Tell us who you are, and then you can do this. And that's the same with a lot of our large vendors like EBSCO and some of the other big ebook vendors. So the initial access is completely anonymous, really, at the vendor's end, but people can choose to use platform tools that need personalization, and then they are giving control of that. They're giving that data themselves. They can see what's going in. Right. So we have a little website on our webpage. We have a little list of the vendors where we have to release more than just a pseudonymous token, and we try to be upfront with people about the fact that, you know, if you want to use these things, they are university systems. You signed up for the university IT, acceptable use of IT policy, which means that we will release this data about you in order to make the systems work. So we try to make sure people understand that connection and what data will be released. But look, it is a really contentious question, and I have a lot of discussions with the senior academics who are concerned about particular vendors having a lot of data, and we always try to make sure that we are passing across the minimal amount possible.
Right. And I was wondering, so have you had any sort of increase in support calls about this subject, or just in general since you moved to federated access?
Complete decrease.
Really?
Yeah. Before, when we were on EasyProxy, my team, who are library staff, not IT specialists, they were managing between 10 and 100 potential license breaches a week, where we'd have to investigate and in many cases try to identify the person or block an access path. And I've had, maybe I get a banned user every couple of weeks who's maybe triggered the multiple country issue. You know, Open Athens will check whether somebody's logging in from multiple countries in the same time period, because that could indicate their account has been hacked. And we get one of those every couple of weeks, especially at the beginning of semester when there's a lot of new students. But we have no license breaches to speak of. We did have one last year, and it was an actual researcher who had downloaded the entire contents of a database, or tried to. So it was one of those genuine naughty people, not somebody who'd stolen some credentials. So moving from the proxy to federated access has just completely removed an entire workload that used to take 1 or 2 staff in my team to manage constantly. And it's just put that all over onto the cybersecurity team of the university, who are very well funded and have lots of really good tools to manage security. And that's really where it should be. Right.
Good. Caroline, you touched earlier on walk-in access, and I know that was one of the things that you struggled with, at least initially, in your project, in terms of being able to switch off IP completely. Can you tell us how you addressed that issue?
Yeah, it took a lot of struggle, and thankfully Open Athens has some really great ways to connect through. So you don't necessarily have to use the local authentication system. They have an API, and we were able to work out how to create a permission set for walk-in users who can't use all of the resources. They can only use some of our collection. And they have to be anonymous, obviously. We've got to have computers that they can walk up to and just use without logging in. And those computers have to let them go through to just that set of resources. So we've used the Open Athens API to create accounts on the fly. We created a little database there where a little page they can walk up to, click a button to get access. They can go in to search our databases or our discovery tool as a walk-in user. They can see just the resources they're allowed to access, and they connect through to them. Because the little web page creates a walk-in user account in Open Athens on the fly, it remembers it in the browser. And the way Open Athens works is, once you've logged in Open Athens in that browser session, it will just carry your authentication across. So they don't need to keep logging into or get any login prompts on any of the resources they might go to. They can simply walk up to the computer, search everything they find they can log into. If they can't use it, we won't show it to them. So it took the IT team quite a while to get that working, because the API bit with Open Athens was actually straightforward. It was already there, and there's a lot of good help pages that helped us to work that out. But we needed a kiosk solution, a standalone kiosk solution. And I guess if you think about the way computers work these days, when was the last time you walked up to a computer and didn't log in? It's very unusual. So that was the challenge. The IT guys had to find out a way to make that work and put it into the library environment with it being secure, not allowing access to the university's research institutes or the data we want to try to keep secure. So that was the tricky bit.
Interesting. Excuse me. I don't see any more questions. Please do send any questions through. We still have a bit of time left. I do have some more of my own, if that's okay.
Sure.
I mean, one of the things I'm interested in is, as we move away from IP, anonymous access to more sort of identified access. It opens up the opportunity for getting some new services around reporting analytics. Is that something that you've explored?
Yeah, we've had a good look at the Open Athens reporting, which has been great because we now have almost everything going through Open Athens. We can, for the first time, see how much usage is from staff and how much is from students. But I guess with your reporting, you need to put the effort in at the beginning in order to get the good results out at the end. And we probably haven't put enough information in yet to get any really startling results out at the end. But we do know, I mean, as soon as the pandemic hit, I started getting a huge number of extra requests for people to know how much usage of particular platforms had changed or not changed. And so at least by having the standard reports in Open Athens, I can add them to the counter reports for our actual resources, and we can show who's getting into resources and then how much they're being used once they do get in there. So not all the vendors provide all that counter compliant statistical information, but at least if you can get some of that from your major vendors, your Open Athens access logs give a little more nuance to what you're seeing, because counter data will never show you that kind of individual use of things.
Right.
But it has also been useful for us. Just last month, we cancelled something, which, we're always looking to make sure we don't cancel things very often, and I hate admitting it in public, but it was one of those small resources that we weren't sure what the usage was. And once we had it in Open Athens, because the vendor didn't provide any statistics, we had exactly the names of the people who had logged into that resource at all in the last year. And there were 4 of them, and 2 were my staff who were setting it up. So, it was pretty obvious whether or not something was being used. So the reporting that you can get from the federated solution like Open Athens will just add a bit to what you've already got if you've got your counter compliance stuff.
Right. Okay. So Caroline, obviously, this project's been very successful for you. You seem very happy with the way things gone. I'm just interested in what kind of sort of change leadership is required to do something like this at quite a big scale, and and just give listeners a sense of the kind of scale, the time frame, how long it took you to actually from the idea to the implementation. Like, well, I know we had the pandemic in the middle, which probably didn't help, but
I think I started off on trying to get Open Athens in March of 2019, and our project didn't kick off until October. We went live with most of our resources in late January 2020, and the pandemic hit us a couple of months later when we were still in the process of updating all of our links, because, the library systems have got so many links to resources, and other people are running systems that you don't know about that link into your resources, and they'll often have hard-coded your old link, and so they're not seeing your new authentication. And it's really difficult. That part of the process was really difficult, finding and changing all of the people's links, finding the people who had workflows that went in a weird way, and gradually shutting them down. So I started off by shutting down some of the access routes for the Elsevier products that were causing us some problems. We had some access methods that were set up by other people, not the library, and that were being used to access library subscriptions. So I did that for Elsevier and a number of other platforms. We just cut off those access methods. People have to come to the library approved access method. And then we ran through this process of setting them up in Open Athens, changing our links, and then looking in our proxy logs to see who's still getting in here and how are they getting here from. And then trying to communicate with people, particularly the owners of learning management systems, intranets, newsletters that go out to the faculty. So there's a big communication process that the faculty liaison librarians helped us with, because we're fortunate to have quite a few at the university. They were able to communicate at faculty meetings that there was a new way of logging into library resources and you might need to change your links. So that took quite a while. I was fortunate that we were doing that at the time that the central IT department were moving to a new authentication tool that included multi-factor authentication. So the library's messages about new authentication and logging in looked just the same as theirs, and so we piggybacked on that. Everyone understands that we're improving the security, and this is how we're doing it. So I'd really encourage anyone who is thinking of doing something like this to talk to the IT department and to try to dovetail in with anything they're doing, particularly if they're improving the authentication at the same time. It will really help if you've got the IT department telling everyone you've got a new way of authenticating, you don't need to, which is great. So I think, though, that probably what people need to know at the outset is that you will not be aware of all the ways that your users get to your resources. Even if you think you are, I guarantee you won't be aware. Somebody will have some weird system or some strange app on their phone that you've never heard of that logs them in, and you'll find out about it when you do this. Right.
Someone did send a sort of related question in around this topic. So how do you engender change management in terms of the existing organizational culture to affect a new IT innovations like Open Athens?
So I actually, I sort of try to lead from the bottom up in that not many people above me in the library executive understand technical issues like this. They're all librarians, and most of them haven't dealt with library systems. There are not many library systems people who go further up. So I don't try to talk to them about technical things. I go and talk to the IT department. So I went and took one of the guys from the cybersecurity team out for coffee, and we had a good chat about, you know, how difficult it was to do cybersecurity. And I built some relationships with the cybersecurity team, and likewise with the privacy team, and with the guys in the IT department who ran the authentication systems. I found out what their priorities were for the year and what their timelines were. And that's how I knew about the new central authentication tool. And I was able to get Open Athens in and move us onto the new tool as, I think, the third system that went onto that new one. By doing that, because the library is a very big, heavy user of authentication, I made a lot of contacts across the university in the technical areas. So I guess my change management is more at that level of operational managers around IT and in the learning management systems and, you know, in the systems area. So that's where I tended to make most impact. Of course, that's changed now because we've had Open Athens in for well over a year, and we've been wholly Open Athens for our Elsevier products for over 6. I think we've switched the IP off only a few months ago, but prior to that, there was hardly any use of it via IP. So we can see that we're pretty much a success story. And I've been doing a lot of presentations to the Council of Australian University Librarians, to other groups that are interested in authentication, and to any publisher groups I can get 5 minutes with to try to promote to them the fact that this is a much easier way for librarians to manage their access. And it'd be great if they would work with federated authentication and vendors like Open Athens more frequently. So it's good to have that relationship with Elsevier as well, being a large publisher in the area who, you know, you can say, well, this is what we did with Elsevier, and we realise you're not as big, but here's this way you can do something with Open Athens that might make it just as easy for your users to get into your platform. So I do a lot of that sort of outward-facing promotion now.
Right, which we appreciate. It's great.
Oh, good. Well, it really does make my life a lot easier not to have to manage a proxy server and all of those problems that came with it.
Right. So. I think this is a question for Christos. Yeah, we hear a lot about ransomware attacks on universities. Is there anything specific that Open Athens is doing to ensure the security of its product? Have you had any breaches that have interrupted your service?
To be honest, I haven't heard anything, but I might need to go back to my team to see if there is anything. One of course, the cost of Open Athens is maintaining the service, so the technical team here and the IT director is looking for ways to make the system more secure on a daily basis. But we haven't heard of anything that would disrupt the service. We use Google servers for scalability and security as well. And one of the things that I'm telling people is that federated access is offering a more secure way of authenticating people rather than IP. IP is a huge risk, and I'm sure plenty of people have heard about malicious websites like the Silent Librarian or Sci-Hub and things like that, which is very, very dangerous for individuals and institutions as well. But not to answer the question, nothing came to my attention the last year or so. But I've noticed by reading around that the cyber attacks have been increased during the pandemic. Lots of bad actors trying, I guess, to steal COVID research from and attacking universities and medical institutions all around the world. So that's another thing that I think we have to bear in mind, especially when we're talking about authentication and single sign-on.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I think I don't see any more questions. I just have maybe one or two more, and maybe then we can wrap up. Caroline, I was wondering if there were any lessons learned that you'd like to share about relying solely on federated access at a major university.
Well, I think the thing that surprised me was the vast number of different apps and workflows that our researchers had that we just weren't aware of. I think librarians kind of tend to think about their own systems first. I guess we all do, don't we? We assume that people are going to be searching in our discovery or our catalogue and they're going to go through to our links to get to resources. But I heard about all of these different apps and tools like papers and bookends, reference management software and workflows that relied upon library authentication, but the library had never heard of. And I think that that's something that was a real eye-opener. Unfortunately, many of them didn't support federated authentication. So I've been in touch with a lot of them to say, hello, we don't use a proxy, we use federated authentication. Can you help me? With mixed results. So, but it is, I think that that's one of the benefits of being at a major institution like the University of Melbourne. If a large institution like mine moves to solely federated authentication, we lead in this space. When we speak to the vendors and say we prefer this, it's more secure, then they are more likely to pick it up and make life easier for the smaller institutions in future. So it was a real surprise to me, though, to see that range of tools and resources and understand how different things were for different researchers. Likewise, it was also a surprise to see just how many systems there were across the university that linked into the library systems that we also didn't know about, because most library systems actually make it easy to share information. That's what they're for. And so people rely on them for all sorts of different reasons. So many systems link into the library systems and you might not necessarily know about it. You do find out when you undertake a project like this exactly who has been linking to your systems and why.
So a journey of discovery, it sounds like.
Yes.
Yeah.
But a good one. I've made lots of new contacts, which has been really helpful.
Great. Okay, well, I think this is going to be my final question. Probably a bit of an unfair question, but I was wondering if you could project ahead 10 years. What's the most prevalent method of accessing library e-resources? Is IP still prevalent, or is federated access going to take?
No, it's definitely going to be federated access. I would say I would be surprised if it takes 10 years for most vendors to be supporting federated access. We've got almost all of ours through Open Athens now, but it's by volume. Over 85% of our use goes through a federated connection because all of the big vendors support it. So, and it is so much more secure. It's also not inherently based around computers. It's about people, and a lot more of the web that we use every day is about you as an individual person. So federated authentication really ties in with the way people think about the web and use it in their everyday life. And so that's the reason why I think it's the way of the future, because it does support people as individuals on the internet rather than machines.
Right. Great. Well, so I think we're coming to the end of the webinar, and if there are no more questions, I would like to thank Caroline and Christos for joining us today, and for all of you who spent the time to listen in and ask questions. As I mentioned at the beginning, the session is being recorded, and we'll be sending you a link afterwards. And I think that is it. So thanks again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.